December 1944, the Ardennes, Belgium. Snow drifts through the shattered remains of a forest. German soldiers, pale with exhaustion, drag themselves along a frozen road. Their boots crunch through ice, the distant rumble of artillery echoing off the hills. Behind them, columns of wrecked panzer tanks smolder in silence. At first, they think it's thunder. But then, a low, rhythmic roar rises from the west. Not aircraft, not guns. It's the sound of steel wheels cutting across rails and an unending growl of locomotives. Through the haze, American trains emerge from the mist. Black engines hissing steam. Flat cars stacked with tanks, trucks, and fuel barrels. The Germans stare in disbelief. These were not reinforcements arriving in weeks. They were arriving today. Every station, every rail yard, every mile of track seemed alive, pulsing with American energy. The same industrial rhythm that built the cars of Detroit now forged a weapon of movement. The German army had once redefined speed with blitzkrieg. But now it was the Americans who mastered movement, faster than the enemy could retreat. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, it faced a continent already burning. Europe had fallen beneath the iron rhythm of the Wehrmacht. Blitzkrieg had proven that speed by not sheer numbers-wise could crush nations. Yet on the other side of the Atlantic, a different kind of speed was awakening. Factories that once built automobiles, refrigerators, and farm tractors were converted almost overnight into arsenals of steel. In Detroit, the blast furnaces of Ford's River Rouge plant poured out metal that would soon roll on tank treads. In Pennsylvania, the Baldwin Locomotive Works expanded around the clock, its whistles marking each completed engine that would haul men and armor to the front. By the end of 1942, the United States had become what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. What made that arsenal lethal was not only production, it was movement. The American railway system, already the largest and most intricate in the world, became the central artery of a global war effort. Over 380,000 miles of track crisscrossed the nation, linking inland steel mills to coastal ports. Each night, locomotives thundered through the darkness carrying boxcars of ammunition, medical supplies, and tanks freshly painted in olive drab. Railway crews worked in 12-hour shifts under strict blackout regulations. Civilians spoke of trains that never slept. Between 1942 and 1945, U.S. railroads moved nearly 2.5 billion tons of war material, a figure greater than all Axis rail traffic combined. Coal, oil, and rolling stock were rationed carefully to keep this machine alive. Every gallon of fuel saved at home meant another tank shipped abroad. In Europe, Germany's logistics were faltering. Years of air raids had shattered marshalling yards and bridges. Locomotive shortages forced commanders to cannibalize engines for spare parts. The Wehrmacht, once a symbol of mechanized precision, was being slowed by its own overreach. Supply lines stretched thin from Normandy to Warsaw. Fuel convoys were ambushed, rails torn apart by Allied bombers, and freight cars abandoned in burning rail yards. Across the Atlantic, American planners studied these reports with scientific obsession. The Office of Defense Transportation synchronized rail schedules with ship departures. Freight trains from Chicago arrived in New York ports just as Liberty ships finished loading the previous cargo. Nothing was wasted. Not a minute, not a mile. Every tank rolling off the assembly line had a path mapped to the battlefield before its engine even started. From Detroit, tanks were loaded onto flat cars bound for Baltimore or New Orleans. There, cranes swung them onto ships, sometimes hundreds a day. Once across the Atlantic, Allied engineers rebuilt French and Belgian railways under fire, laying fresh track to feed the advancing armies. It was a scale of coordination unseen in history. A logistical ballet where locomotives replaced cavalry and timetables replaced tactics. But behind the statistics were faces, young railroad men who had traded overalls for Army uniforms. They formed the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, the engineers, conductors, and brakemen who turned logistics into a combat weapon. They repaired bomb-cratered bridges, ran supply trains through enemy artillery zones, and kept the lines moving no matter the cost. To the Germans, this invisible war seemed impossible to match. In 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt privately admitted that American replacements and vehicles arrive faster than we can destroy them. The heart of blitzkrieg, rapid concentration of force, was being outpaced by an opponent whose strength lay not in speed of attack, but in speed of arrival. By mid-1944, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy, The rail convoys had become the spine of that advance. Each day, thousands of tons of supplies rolled inland from the ports of Cherbourg and Omaha Beach. Engineers converted captured German tracks to the wider American gauge, ensuring that U.S. trains could push deep into France. The front line was moving east, and the rail lines moved with it. The Germans called it Materialschlacht, the Battle of Materials. Yet what stunned them most was not just the quantity, but the pace. Factories, railroads, ships, and soldiers operated as one breathing organism, stretching from the Great Lakes to the forests of Europe. And in that organism, the heartbeat was the train, endless, mechanical, relentless. The rhythm of steel that began in Detroit would soon thunder across the fields of France, echoing through every valley the Wehrmacht tried to hold. By the summer of 1944, the Allies had secured a foothold in Western Europe. The beaches of Normandy were no longer front lines, they were gateways. But behind the thunder of artillery and the roar of advancing armor, another war unfolded quietly, the war of supply. When the first American tanks rolled ashore, they were followed not by infantry columns but by engineers and railroad specialists. Their mission was clear: rebuild Europe's shattered railways 1 mile at a time. Bridges blown apart by German demolition teams were replaced within days. Tracks twisted by bombings were straightened and relaid under fire. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps deployed entire rail battalions. Each unit brought locomotives, flat cars, cranes, and signal equipment packed into Liberty ships. In the ruins of French coastal towns, soldiers erected makeshift depots, using captured German wagons to supplement Allied trains. Within weeks, freight lines were running from Cherbourg to Saint-Lô, from Paris to the front at Metz. The railway war had begun, and it moved with breathtaking speed. The key to this miracle was preparation. Before D-Day, American planners had already mapped every major European rail junction from aerial reconnaissance and resistance reports. Civil engineers back in the U.S. had designed modular bridges, prefabricated rails, and mobile workshops that could be assembled in the field. When the invasion began, the logistical blueprint was already waiting. Every tank, truck, and ration box that landed on French soil had a coded route number. Red, blue, and green routes divided the continent into arteries of motion. But while roads fed the armies, it was the railways that kept them alive. Still, the system faced limits. The farther Allied troops pushed inland, the longer their supply lines became. Roads clogged with convoys of fuel trucks and depots overflowed with ammunition. The answer came in a bold logistical gamble: the creation of the Red Ball Express. From August to November 1944, more than 6,000 trucks, driven mostly by African American soldiers, thundered day and night between Normandy and the advancing front. Painted with a red circle insignia, their convoys raced non-stop, carrying fuel and shells to Patton's Third Army. Drivers slept in their trucks, ate cold rations, and navigated bomb-cratered roads under blackout conditions. The Red Ball Express became a legend of movement, but it was only half the story. While trucks roared over roads, rail convoys rolled behind them, carrying the heavy loads no vehicle could handle. Each locomotive pulled hundreds of tons, tanks, artillery, and entire units in motion. By September 1944, Allied engineers had repaired over 2,000 miles of railway in northern France and Belgium. In just 3 months, trains had carried more than 4 million tons of supplies to the front. What took Germany weeks to move by road, America could move by rail in days. The German high command struggled to comprehend it. Reports from retreating divisions described an enemy that arrives with entire armored divisions overnight. Captured rail maps revealed freshly painted Allied insignias on former Wehrmacht depots, evidence that the Americans were not just using captured rail systems, but improving them. Inside German headquarters, officers debated how to slow the advance. Bridges were blown, but within 48 hours, American engineers built replacements from Bailey bridge kits. Sabotage teams cut rails, but replacement sections were waiting on the next train. The cycle never stopped. Meanwhile, American production continued at home without pause. By late 1944, U.S. factories were producing one M4 Sherman tank every 30 minutes and one locomotive every 24 hours. For every German train destroyed, 3 more American ones were arriving on French soil. To the Wehrmacht, retreat became a race not against soldiers but against machinery. Even when panzer divisions managed to regroup, they found their flanks overtaken by American columns supported by fresh armor, delivered straight from ports via rail. As the Allies crossed the Seine and advanced toward the Siegfried Line, the railway network grew behind them like a living organism. Supply hubs emerged in Reims, Liège, and Nancy. Sidings extended into open fields where temporary depots stacked with shells and fuel barrels stretched to the horizon. By the time the first Allied trains reached the German border, their efficiency had become almost surreal. Crews could unload a train of 40 tanks in under an hour, refuel them, and have them rolling east by dawn. The Germans had prided themselves on efficiency, on precision logistics that once powered the blitzkrieg. Yet now they watched that principle turned against them, perfected, scaled, and mechanized by a nation that treated logistics as art. Every revolution in modern warfare, from air power to armor, depended on movement. And in 1944, the United States had made movement its most powerful weapon. The stage was set for the coming shock, when Germany would realize that the war was no longer being decided by tactics or bravery, but by the unstoppable rhythm of American trains. For every tank that reached the front, there was a man behind the engine, a soldier not in uniformed glory but in grease and soot. In 1944, the U.S. Army Transportation Corps numbered over 165,000 men. Many had never seen combat but lived every day under the threat of it. Their battleground was a stretch of track, their weapon a locomotive. These were railroaders, mechanics, switchmen, and engineers, who had traded the safety of American stations for the smoke of Europe's shattered railways. They worked through nights that smelled of oil and cordite. Air raid sirens wailed, but trains never stopped. In Belgium, Allied crews repaired twisted rails by the light of burning freight cars. In northern France, they slept in engine cabs ready to move at the first signal. When shells struck near the tracks, they ducked and waited for silence, then climbed out to keep the trains rolling. Their efficiency bordered on obsession. A derailment that would take a civilian crew days to clear was often resolved in hours. They built makeshift cranes from tank parts, melted down scrap steel for rails, and scavenged German locomotives to replace damaged ones. They were men like Sergeant Bill McCauley, a former switch operator from Illinois, who later wrote, "We hauled more steel in a week than I'd seen in my life, and all of it pointed east." To them, every whistle in the dark was a promise that the war was still moving forward. For the Germans who saw these trains arriving at the front, the psychological effect was devastating. Captured soldiers spoke of endless trains filled with armor, as if the Americans possessed a bottomless reserve. The front was no longer just a battlefield, and it was a conveyor belt. And behind that belt were men who never stopped moving. If human endurance was the heart of the system, technology was its skeleton. American trains in Europe were not improvised. They were designed for war. Before D-Day, the U.S. War Department had ordered the construction of thousands of S-160 steam locomotives, built by Baldwin Alco and Lima. Compact, rugged, and simple to maintain, they were shipped in crates across the Atlantic. Each one was designed to operate on rough, bomb-damaged European tracks and could burn any available fuel, coal, wood, or oil. The first S-160s arrived in 1943, long before Allied troops did. They were assembled in British workshops, then ferried to the continent once ports were secure. Crews nicknamed them Yanks on Rails. By late 1944, over 2,000 American-built locomotives were running in liberated Europe. These trains were built for military precision. Their couplers matched American-style flat cars, allowing the rapid loading of tanks, half-tracks, and artillery. Specialized ramps and hydraulic cranes allowed heavy armor to be rolled onto trains directly from depots. Each train operated like a moving fortress, escorted by repair units and security detachments with scheduled radio check-ins. If an air raid destroyed part of the line, bulldozers cleared the wreckage, engineers rebuilt it, and the same train continued forward within hours. To the Wehrmacht, accustomed to meticulously timed yet fragile logistics, this system was alien. German rail operations depended on centralized planning and vulnerable junctions. When Allied bombers shattered bridges and depots, replacement took weeks. For the Americans, flexibility was the key. Every engineer carried pre-made track panels, replacement ties, and bridge kits. The goal wasn't to maintain perfection, it was to maintain motion. Even more remarkable was how seamlessly American industrial design adapted to foreign terrain. French and Belgian tracks used different gauges. German switches were incompatible with U.S. rolling stock. So the Transportation Corps developed modular converters, enabling American locomotives to run on any line within hours of arrival. By the time Allied forces reached the Rhine, the rail network was no longer European or American. It was simply Allied. Technology had turned logistics into warfare. The very rails beneath the soldiers' boots were part of a living, expanding organism, one that carried victory mile by mile. For General George S. Patton, the lesson of Blitzkrieg was simple: speed wins wars. But speed required fuel, ammunition, and fresh tanks, and that required trains. Patton's Third Army, in its lightning advance across France, consumed 400,000 gallons of fuel per day. When road convoys fell behind, it was the railway that kept his armor alive. Each day, supply trains brought forward entire replacement tank battalions. Even when Patton outpaced his maps, American locomotives were already rumbling behind him, carrying the means to sustain the momentum. The tactical brilliance lay in the rhythm between attack and resupply. When a division captured a key town, engineers followed within hours. Tracks were cleared, stations converted into depots, and within 24 hours supply trains arrived. This cycle, advance, secure, rebuild, supply, became the heartbeat of the Allied advance across Europe. German commanders couldn't understand how American offensives never seemed to pause. Even after counterattacks forced retreats, the next morning fresh armor appeared, transported overnight by rail. Intelligence reports described it with disbelief. The enemy's transport efficiency exceeds our expectation of mechanical possibility. Tanks, once symbols of offense, had become passengers of a new kind of weapon: logistics. By late 1944, every trainload of Shermans represented not just reinforcements but inevitability. The Germans were no longer fighting an army. They were fighting a machine that fed itself. And that machine was gathering speed. At the top of the Allied command chain, logistics was not background work. It was strategy itself. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a calm analytical commander, viewed supply as the foundation of every battlefield decision. He once remarked, "Battles are won by armies that move, and armies move by fuel." Unlike many generals trained in the traditions of maneuver and combat, Eisenhower understood the invisible war of rails, ports, and depots. Before D-Day, he insisted that half of all planning focus on transportation. Each beachhead, each bridge, each captured town would be judged not only by tactical gain, but by whether it could sustain a rail connection. Patton, his restless field commander, saw logistics as the pulse of aggression. "Keep moving," he told his staff, "and let supply figure it out." Supply did figure it out, through sheer will and engineering genius. Patton's armored divisions advanced so rapidly that their supply lines were redrawn weekly. Entire rail units were reassigned just to follow his columns. General Brehon Somerville, head of the U.S. Army Service Forces, oversaw a logistical empire larger than any field command in history. Under his supervision, more than 30,000 locomotives and rail cars were shipped overseas, along with the crews to run them. Somerville viewed logistics not as support, but as a combat multiplier. His philosophy, "no front without a train," became the silent creed of the Allied advance. Eisenhower's genius lay in coordination. He synchronized Patton's aggression, Bradley's caution, and Montgomery's structure into a single advancing organism, all fed by a vast circulatory system of railways. Every mile conquered extended the network. Every bridge repaired gave birth to another artery. By 1945, the Allies weren't improvising logistics. They were conducting it like an orchestra. And Eisenhower was the conductor. Inside the crumbling headquarters of the German High Command, reports from the front read like notes of disbelief. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, reviewed captured Allied logistics data in late 1944 and reportedly said, "Their industry fights as our divisions once did." German intelligence analysts confirmed what frontline soldiers were already witnessing, that American trains and convoys were replenishing entire divisions faster than the Germans could retreat. In the past, the Wehrmacht had relied on rail superiority to execute lightning war. Now, Allied logistics had turned that same principle into an overwhelming weapon. After the Falaise Pocket disaster, where thousands of German vehicles were abandoned, intercepted radio messages revealed panic in the ranks. One division commander described enemy trains arriving each dawn with armor, as if from a factory next door. The German rail system, once meticulously efficient, had collapsed under relentless Allied bombing. Coal shortages crippled locomotives. Crews were overworked, rails sabotaged, switches frozen in winter. Meanwhile, the Americans arrived with ready-made rail battalions, stocked depots, and fuel by the millions of gallons. Wehrmacht officers wrote that the Allies seemed to have an inexhaustible horizon of metal. Even more demoralizing was the perception that the Americans were not slowed by setbacks. Bomb a bridge, it was replaced. Destroy a train, 2 more arrived. The rhythm of Allied advance felt mechanical, impersonal, unstoppable. German morale cracked not just under bombardment but under realization. The same principle that had made them masters of blitzkrieg, speed and synchronization, had now been mastered, perfected, and scaled beyond imagination. For the first time in the war, German officers began to admit that defeat might no longer be a question of bravery or skill, but of arithmetic. Behind the thunder of artillery and the screams of battle lay a quieter truth. The Second World War was above all a war of endurance. And endurance was born from industry. In America's cities far from the front, millions of civilians became soldiers of production. Women riveted steel plates onto tanks. Blacksmiths repaired locomotives bound for France. African-American railway crews kept the Red Ball Express alive through exhaustion and discrimination alike. Each wrench turn, each rivet, each shift mattered. They didn't know where their tank would roll or where their train would go, only that it had to reach a soldier before the enemy did. That unity of purpose gave the Allied system moral power. It was not simply industrial strength, it was industrial will. The U.S. didn't just produce machines, and it produced momentum. Strategically, that momentum shattered the Axis model of warfare. The German army, engineered for rapid offense and short campaigns, was unequipped for a war of endless resupply. America, with its vast resources and rail infrastructure, turned war into a sustained operation that never ran out of breath. And morally, the sight of those trains, line after line, bringing relief, bringing victory, became symbols of inevitability. Soldiers on the front began to trust that they would never be left behind. As long as the trains run, one sergeant wrote in his diary, we can't lose. The Germans, meanwhile, came to see them as omens. Each whistle in the distance meant another division reborn, another front reinforced. Logistics had ceased to be invisible. It had become destiny. And destiny by 1945 was made of iron and steam. August 1944, northern France. The fields near Falaise are littered with wreckage. Burned-out panzers lie in ditches, their tracks twisted, their crews gone. German soldiers stumble eastward through the smoke, stunned and starving. Overhead, Allied planes circle like vultures. In the distance, the faint echo of engines, not trucks, not tanks, but trains. The Allies had closed the Falaise pocket, trapping nearly 50,000 German troops. The German army, once the model of movement, was now fighting in reverse. Its fuel reserves were nearly gone. Its transport network was in ruins. And yet, as they retreated, they found American columns advancing faster than they could fall back. The explanation came in steel and steam. Behind the advancing U.S. Army moved a vast mechanical tide, thousands of trains carrying armor, ammunition, and men. Each captured French town was quickly transformed into a logistical hub. Railway engineers arrived within hours of liberation, surveying damage, laying new track, and connecting sidings to depots. Within days, freight trains were rolling again, packed with Shermans, fuel trucks, and field hospitals. This was no accident. It was the culmination of 2 years of planning. Long before D-Day, Allied intelligence had mapped every European rail line, bridge, and junction. When the invasion came, American engineers didn't just fight their way across France, they rebuilt it as they advanced. At Cherbourg, the first major port reopened under Allied control. Trains began departing almost as soon as the docks were cleared of mines. Loaded with tanks from Liberty ships, they thundered inland toward Saint-Lô and Avranches. From there, supply flowed to the armored spearheads pushing east. The Germans tried to destroy what they couldn't hold. Bridges were blown, rail yards cratered. But the Americans had anticipated every loss. Portable Bailey bridges replaced destroyed crossings in hours. Temporary sidings bypassed shattered stations. Bulldozers cleared rubble while trains waited on the line, engines idling. The Wehrmacht's retreat became chaotic. Motorized divisions ran out of fuel and abandoned vehicles by the hundreds. Horses, once the backbone of German logistics, collapsed from exhaustion. Even elite panzer units were stranded, their tanks motionless for lack of gasoline. Meanwhile, American trains brought motion itself. At the height of the pursuit across France, the U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies advanced nearly 30 miles per day, a pace unseen in modern warfare. For every mile gained, rail lines followed. In less than 3 months, over 2,000 miles of track had been repaired or newly built. It was logistics at the speed of combat. Each morning, the same pattern repeated. Engineers arrived at dawn, supplies at noon, armor by sunset. The next day, the front moved again, and so did the rails. By late August, as Paris was liberated, the German High Command faced a grim realization. They could no longer calculate the speed of the Allied advance. Intelligence reports showed trains unloading armor in towns they had believed still under German control just days earlier. The U.S. Army's logistical speed had become unpredictable and unstoppable. Patton's Third Army was the embodiment of that momentum. His tanks, fueled by rail convoys and the Red Ball Express, raced across France so fast that even Allied headquarters struggled to keep up. When fuel shortages briefly threatened to halt the advance near Metz, emergency rail deliveries from Cherbourg arrived overnight, saving the offensive. German commanders were stunned. In previous wars, logistics dictated the limits of attack. Now logistics had become the weapon itself, a rolling, breathing force. From behind every American division came the hum of rail wheels, the hiss of steam, and the metallic pulse of coordination. It was a sound the Germans could neither replicate nor silence. By September, the Rhine River loomed ahead, the last natural barrier before Germany itself. Bridges had been destroyed, and the Germans believed that would buy them time. But as they retreated, reconnaissance reported trains moving east, Allied trains, already unloading bridging equipment and pontoon ferries near the riverbanks. It was the moment when German officers finally understood. The enemy wasn't just advancing by road or tank. The enemy was advancing by rail. The very speed that once defined blitzkrieg had been outmatched, overwhelmed, and replaced by a new kind of warfare, one fueled not by gasoline but by logistics itself. And that realization marked the beginning of the end. November 1944, the Western Front, the once proud Rhine frontier, Germany's ancient shield, lay ahead. Rivers swollen by autumn rain, bridges shattered by retreating engineers, towns burning on the horizon. To German commanders, this was supposed to be the line where the Allies would pause. Supply chains, they believed, could not stretch any farther. No army could maintain momentum across hundreds of miles of wrecked terrain. They were wrong. From behind the hills came the low, rolling thunder of American trains. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps had turned war into a moving factory. Portable depots, rail-mounted cranes, and endless convoys of flat cars arrived daily. Entire locomotive workshops had been shipped across the Atlantic, reassembled in Belgium and northern France, and were now repairing engines on site. As German intelligence tried to predict where the next American push would strike, the answer arrived faster than they could report it. Trains unloaded tanks at dawn. By nightfall, those same tanks were advancing through the next valley. The Americans weren't just attacking, they were arriving everywhere at once. In early December, when the Ardennes forest fell silent under the first snow, the Germans launched one final counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's gamble was rooted in a single belief, that the Allies had overextended themselves. If his panzer divisions could break through the thin American lines, they could capture Allied fuel depots and cut supply routes. At first, the surprise worked. Dense fog grounded Allied aircraft, and U.S. units were forced into a desperate defensive retreat. German tanks surged west, consuming what little fuel they had left. But beneath the snow, the logistical machine was already awakening. As soon as the weather cleared, Allied rail operations roared back to life. Within hours, supply trains loaded with ammunition and reinforcements began arriving in Liège, Namur, and Bastogne, sometimes under direct artillery fire. Crews unloaded tanks by lantern light, guided by MPs shouting through the cold. From those sidings came the steel reinforcements that would save the front. The same speed that had crushed Germany and France now reversed its last offensive. Fuel convoys, ammunition shipments, even entire artillery regiments arrived faster than the Germans could maneuver. The U.S. First Army's supply flow doubled within 2 weeks, an impossible statistic achieved through pure rail coordination. By Christmas 1944, the German spearhead had stalled. Panzer columns ran out of fuel in the snow. their crews abandoning tanks where they stood. American trains continued rolling even through shell fire. They carried everything: fuel, shells, food, and on the return trips, the wounded and prisoners. When the fog lifted completely, Allied bombers destroyed what remained of German transport hubs. The Wehrmacht's dream of cutting Allied supply lines vanished beneath waves of iron. Instead, their own divisions were trapped, their escape routes obliterated. The tide turned. In February 1945, the Allied front advanced again, faster than before. Rail units crossed the Meuse and Moselle, pushing track-laying operations right to the Rhine's edge. Engineers built bridges under fire, each one capable of bearing full freight trains. Within days, locomotives were rolling across newly conquered German soil. In towns like Remagen, where an intact bridge was captured in March, trains carrying tanks and supplies crossed within 24 hours of the 1st Infantry. It was a logistical coup so swift that even Eisenhower reportedly called it the moment the war was lost for Germany. For the German soldiers now defending their homeland, the realization came slowly, then all at once. Every time they withdrew to a new defensive line, American armor was already waiting. Every time they destroyed a bridge, another appeared. Every time they hoped for a pause, the trains arrived. What they faced was not simply a stronger army, but a force of continuous motion. A weaponized system of industry and organization unlike anything seen in warfare. The Wehrmacht's field commanders no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of delay, of holding actions, of lines to buy time. But time was exactly what the Americans had taken away. In late March 1945, the first U.S. freight trains entered German territory under their own steam. Civilians watched silently as endless flat cars of armor rolled eastward. Smoke from their stacks drifted above ruined villages, a gray curtain marking the end of the Third Reich's reach. The symbol was unmistakable. Germany's own railways, once tools of conquest, now carried the engines of its defeat. The sound of Allied locomotives echoing through the Rhine Valley wasn't just the arrival of tanks. It was the sound of history accelerating toward its conclusion. Spring 1945, the heart of Germany. The thunder of artillery began to fade. Villages that had been sealed off by fire and smoke now stood open to the horizon. Across the shattered rail lines and bridges, American engineers moved like ghosts among the ruins, rebuilding, reconnecting, restoring motion. Within weeks of crossing the Rhine, entire divisions were being supplied not by temporary convoys but by regular train schedules. Freight cars rolled in with ammunition, rations, and medical supplies and rolled out again with prisoners and wounded. It was no longer a war fought on desperation. It was a war run by a timetable. The Wehrmacht, now split and fragmented, faced a reality few had ever imagined. German commanders found themselves surrendering not just to soldiers, but to an entire machine of organization. A system so vast that it could feed, fuel, and move millions across continents. What had once been the terrifying precision of blitzkrieg was now mirrored and surpassed by Allied logistics. By April, rail networks captured in Western Germany were fully operational under Allied control. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps managed more than 15,000 locomotives and tens of thousands of freight cars across liberated Europe. Engineers repaired track by night, ran supply schedules by day, and in some regions moved material faster than during peacetime operations. The statistics tell their own story. Between D-Day and the German surrender, Allied rail services transported more than 20 million tons of supplies. They laid over 10,000 miles of new or restored track, and they moved tanks, trucks, and artillery at a rate no army in history had ever achieved. German generals later admitted what they had failed to understand, that logistics, not firepower, had decided the war. The American system of supply and movement had erased the traditional limits of warfare. Distance no longer mattered. Weather no longer slowed them. And destruction itself, bridges, depots, rail yards, became temporary obstacles repaired within hours. Inside German cities, the civilians could see it too. They watched trains roll by carrying more supplies than their entire nation could now produce. For them, it was the final quiet humiliation, the realization that industrial power had defeated ideology. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was now grounded and starving for fuel. Panzer divisions that once advanced 100 miles in days could barely move a dozen for lack of gasoline. The German rail system, bombed and fractured, lay in twisted wreckage. while the American trains rolled unhindered right over its remains. In April, as U.S. forces advanced on the Elbe, the same rhythmic sound echoed again, the mechanical heartbeat of trains bringing up replacements, fuel, and rations. It was relentless, methodical, and precise. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended not with a single explosion or breakthrough, but with an exhaustion of motion. The German army could no longer move while the Americans never stopped. Every freight whistle, every steel wheel turning in the night had been part of that victory. The war of movement, once Germany's greatest strength, had become the instrument of its defeat. Summer 1945, Europe lay silent. The smoke had cleared, but the rails still sang. Across the continent, the metallic rhythm of locomotives carried not soldiers now, but supplies for survival, food, medicine, and refugees. What had once delivered tanks and artillery was now delivering hope. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps did not stop with victory. Their network became the backbone of recovery. The same engineers who had built mobile depots and rolling stock under fire now rebuilt shattered railways across France, Belgium, and Germany. Civilian life was reborn along those tracks. Where panzer divisions once thundered, children now watched American trains pass carrying wheat instead of war. In the months that followed, historians and commanders began to grasp the scale of what had been achieved. The success of the Allied supply chain was not merely a triumph of logistics, it was a revolution in warfare. For the first time, an army had fought and won a continental campaign entirely supported by mechanized transport. The concept of speed had been redefined, not by tanks charging across plains, but by trains moving unseen behind them. When post-war studies compared production numbers, the conclusion was staggering. The United States had shipped nearly 130,000 railroad cars, 2,000 locomotives, and tens of thousands of trucks and tanks to Europe. Each component had arrived by ship, been reassembled in ports, and then distributed inland at industrial tempo. Germany, by contrast, had been unable to replace even a fraction of its destroyed locomotives after 1943. What had once been the German advantage, efficiency, coordination, and precision, had become the American hallmark. And this shift extended far beyond the battlefield. The wartime mastery of logistics laid the foundation for a new global order. When peace returned, those same supply networks evolved into trade routes and reconstruction programs. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after the war relied on the same ships, rails, and depots first designed for combat. For the soldiers who had lived through it, the sound of a train whistle would never be ordinary again. To them it meant survival, the arrival of fuel, food, reinforcements, or rescue. In their memories, the steady rhythm of wheels on rails became the soundtrack of victory. To the Germans who had once believed that blitzkrieg would forever dominate modern war, the lesson was devastating. The lightning war had been defeated by something even faster, a storm of organization. Their armies could maneuver brilliantly, but they could not outpace an opponent who had turned supply into science. As Europe rebuilt, the German rail engineers who had once served the Reich now worked under Allied supervision, restoring bridges and lines. In time, their expertise helped unify a divided continent once again, this time not for conquest but for cooperation. By 1946, the American railway system in Europe was officially handed over to civilian authorities. The locomotives were repainted, the flat cars converted for cargo, but their legacy endured. Each bolt and rail carried the story of how an industrial democracy had turned motion into power. In the ruins of the Third Reich, a new truth had emerged, that the strength of a nation was not only in its armies, but in its ability to move them. From the beaches of Normandy to the bridges of the Rhine, the war had been decided by engines, steel, and willpower. And in the final tally, the side that could deliver tanks faster than the enemy could retreat was the side that shaped the modern world. The Second World War was often remembered for its battles, the courage of soldiers, the fire of tanks, the roar of aircraft above burning cities. But beneath all that fury ran something quieter and far more powerful. It was movement, the ability to take raw steel from a factory in Michigan and place it on a battlefield in France within days, the ability to cross oceans, rebuild ports, and run trains through shattered continents without ever pausing. It was this rhythm, steady, patient, unstoppable, that defeated an empire built on speed. Germany had tried to conquer the world with the idea of lightning war, But in the end, it was defeated by something slower, more enduring. An army that understood that victory is not just fought, it is sustained. The story of the American trains that delivered tanks faster than the enemy could retreat is not only a tale of engineering. It is a reminder of how civilizations endure. Power lies not merely in the weapon, but in the road that carries it, the bridge that holds, the rail that connects. After the guns fell silent, the same systems that won the war rebuilt the peace. The locomotives that once carried death now carried food. The depots once filled with ammunition became the arteries of recovery. And as Europe healed, the sound of trains rolling through the night no longer meant invasion. It meant that life was moving forward again. In the long echo of that sound lies the truth of modern war, that the ultimate weapon is not the tank or the gun, but the power to move faster, farther, and longer than the storm itself. The men who built those trains did not fight on the front lines, but they carried victory on their shoulders, mile by mile, wheel by wheel, until the world began to move again.